to now do a presentation.
Thank you very much, Yunus, for the introduction, and thanks to the Katrada Foundation for marking the 40th anniversary of Dr. Dadoo's death and for inviting me to speak. As an historian, I've been asked to speak about Dr. Dadoo's quest for non-racialism based on a paper that I wrote for a conference on the centenary of his birth in 2009. And as a disclaimer, the paper was written as I was fresh off my PhD, and I thought that every single twist and turn in the history of the ANC in exile was the most important topic in the world. I still think that that's the case, but perhaps I would have sent a shorter version of the paper or a revised version given more time, but I'll try and summarize as best as I can some of the key issues, I think, of some of the key developments that emerged from the paper. And hopefully we can have a discussion. The paper comes from my PhD research on the South African liberation movement in exile in the 1960s, and this has been viewed in the historiography as a period of political quiescence following the banning of the liberation movement, the turn to arms struggle, and the subsequent crackdown by the apartheid regime on the resistance movement, leading to the arrest, imprisonment, banishment, and political exile of hundreds of activists. But I argue in the thesis in which the figure of Dr. Dadoo looms large, but this was also a critical decade of reorganization in which the liberation movement had to overcome some of the enormous difficulties that arose out of the exile context. First amongst this was the huge distance from South Africa of countries like Tanzania and Zambia, where the ANC could initially set up bases. The apartheid South Africa at the time was still surrounded by friendly colonial and white minority regimes that provided buffers around its borders. And secondly, was the scattering of the exiled member of the liberation movements in countries all over the world. So the paper focuses in particular on a set of debates that concerned the reorganization of the ANC and the Congress Alliance, as well as the SACP in exile in the period between Sharpeville and the Morogoro Conference of 1969. These debates in which Dadoo was a key player, culminated in the decision by the ANC to open up membership to non-Africans at Morogoro, and with the creation of a new non-racial body called the Revolutionary Council that was chaired by Oliver Tambo with Dadoo as his deputy, to bring together under a single umbrella leadership the political and military spheres of the struggle. Dadoo had been amongst the first in a small group of South African leaders from different organizations to leave the country in the aftermath of Sharpeville. Amongst them was also the then ANC Deputy President Oliver Tambo, as well as representatives of the Pan-Africanist Congress. And under pressure from African states, and especially Ghana, these South African leaders in exile decided to come together by forming a joint structure that was known as the South African Unity Front. As this began to collapse in late 1961, early 1962, the ANC and other organizations in the Congress Alliance started to discuss what would be required to replace the United Front. In the early 1960s, the leaders of newly independent African states were not accustomed to the ANC's approach on race, and distrusted its policy of cooperation with Indians and whites, especially communists, as Mandela discovered during his tour of the continent in the first half of 1962. He was taken aback by the support that the PAC had gained on the continent. And when he arrived in London and met with Yusuf Dadoo after traveling to several African countries, he told Dadoo that the ANC must show itself now as an independent force to be represented only by Africans. After his return to South Africa, the phrase, the image which the ANC presented to the outside world, became the nucleus of discussions which led to the formulation of a policy known as the African image. And it was according to this principle that the ANC began to set up offices in various countries at this stage, mainly in African cities. And these were in fact in practice ANC offices led by ANC personnel that was responsible to the ANC executive. By the mid-1960s, however, the African image policy increasingly came to the fore as a stumbling block to the full participation of all exiles into the structures and works of the ANC in exile. And this problem applied especially to the London context, where the majority of white, Indian, and colored exiles were based. As with few exceptions, African countries had been reluctant to host them as long-term residents. On the other hand, ANC members going into exile, including prominent SACP leaders such as the General Secretary Moses Kotane and the Chairman J.B. Marks, established themselves in African capitals which hosted ANC offices and worked as full-time ANC officials. So the first steps towards strengthening relations between the ANC external missions and other organizations in the Congress Alliance were initiated around September 65, when on Tambo's initiative, a series of meetings of supporters of the Congress movement were held in London. Tambo then appointed a committee to draft proposals for submission to the ANC headquarters in Morogoro. And the committee members were Yusuf Dadoo, Joe Slovo, and Joe Matthews. The committee produced an initial memorandum which identified a twofold problem. First, there was the problem of maintaining a close liaison between the leadership of all the organizations in the alliance, the Indian Congress, the Colored People Congress, SACTU, as well as former COD members. And secondly, there was the issue of mobilization at all levels of a large number of South Africans that were now living in the UK. In fact, it should be noted that as early as 1966, after consultations with OR, the ANC and student section was formed in London by young activists. And this body, following the example already set by MK, was non-racial. It was chaired by Thabo Mbeki and included a second memorandum was sent to Morogoro by the London Congress Committee in 1966, which at this stage also included an analysis of the situation in South Africa and internationally, and the proposal to hold a meeting of top-level leaders of the former Congress Alliance partners. The committee noted that at the international level, Africa had revealed to be an unstable factor as an aid and assistance to our struggle. According to Vladimir Shubin, by 1965, 85% of ANC funds came from the Soviet Union and socialist countries. And incidentally, it had been Dadoo who had initiated Soviet support during his first visit to the USSR in July 1960. And this question of the unreliability of African assistance is a point that's worth emphasizing, given that the African image policy had been primarily geared towards this. Then on the home front, the London Committee spoke in the memorandum of the liberation forces as being engaged in a struggle for power by revolutionary means in all fields, political, economic, social, and military. Such was the emergency situation, they argued, that a nation at war requires a council of war. The leaders outside the country have to do what no longer can be done at home, to formulate policy and take practical steps to give leadership to our respective communities and the South African people as a whole. It is in the spirit and tradition of our movement that all the various groups and organizations that constitute the forces of revolution in our country must do this work together and not in isolation from one another. After the arrest of the first and second high commands of the MK, the leadership of MK had in effect passed to the ANC external mission. An ANC committee that was known as the Planning Council had been set up under Tambo's overall leadership to replace the old High Command and direct MK operations. However, unlike the High Command, whose composition, like that of MK, was non-racial, the Planning Council was an exclusively ANC body. This meant that non-African communists who had played a prominent role in the formation of MK as well as the sabotage campaign now found themselves cut off from the direction of MK. And the proposal of a Council of War not only represented a plea for inclusion into MK's affair, but also implied recognition by the London group that armed activity was now the most important strategy by which the struggle could now be advanced. And both the idea of the Council of War and this strategic assessment in some way realized in the decision, the strategy and tactics document adopted at Morogoro and the creation of the Revolutionary Council. Anyway, an agency subcommittee consisting of Kotane, J.B. Marks, and Dumanokwe was tasked with responding to the London comrades, but they opposed the proposals to set up a Council of War, and by drawing attention to the fact that not all organizations that were formally associated with the Congress Alliance had in fact adopted struggle. I'm going to have to cut because it's very long discussion. Let me see. So, yeah, just to note that some of these divisions between London and the ANC in Tanzania also cut across the SACP. With SACP leaders, you know, prominent on both sides of the conversation, but finding themselves at opposite ends on this question of external representation. The meeting was of the joint congresses was finally convened in Morogoro in November 1966, and this was the official meeting of the Congress Alliance partners in exile. And the debate at this meeting essentially centered around the nature of the organizational structure at home and abroad on the basis of the exchanges that had already taken place between London and the ANC in Africa. At this meeting, most ANC members present continued to discuss the idea of a Council of War on the basis that not everyone had adopted armed struggle, while the London-based comrades emphasized the importance of mobilizing all the racial groups through the creation of suitable structures. Yusuf Dadoo at this meeting showed signs of impatience with the insistence on the idea that South African Indians were non-violent. He stated, "It's not true that we are wedded to passive resistance. South African Indians had been amongst MK's early recruits and operatives in the sabotage campaign. Many of them had been arrested during the Rivonia period and were serving sentences on Robben Island alongside ANC prisoners. For Dadoo, Dadoo argued that the leadership which is being given by the ANC should be given by all, as the people at home had been left in a political vacuum and were looking up to the leadership outside for guidance. He concluded the stage has been reached when all the people should participate in armed struggle. We are being told to subordinate ourselves. Even the members of the ANC must subordinate themselves. If it's the considered view of this meeting that the ANC can go it alone, let it be so. But is this the correct thing? If it's not decided today to have a council of this type, referring to the Council of War, we will be faced with the same problem in the not so distant future. In the end, it would take another 3 years growing disaffection within MK's rank and file in the aftermath of the Wanki and Sipolilo campaigns. Some of this was vented in the so-called Honey Memorandum for the ANC to give into pressures to review its structure, strategy, and tactics. The Morogoro Conference of 1969 can be viewed as the climax of the discussions that had been taking place between the ANC external mission and members of other Congress organizations and the party based in London in the second half of the 60s. Amongst the key resolutions were the decision to open membership to non-Africans, although with some restrictions, and the creation of a revolutionary council. The second most important development coming out of Morogoro was the outlining of a revolutionary strategy in the document Strategy and Tactics, which was adopted at the conference. Here, the armed struggle was identified as the only method left open for the winning of freedom in South Africa. It also spoke of the overthrow of white supremacy and the development of the conditions for the future all-out war, which will eventually lead to the conquest of power. At the same time, it placed MK under the overall political leadership of the ANC. And this document provided for the first time since the ANC's banning in 1960 with a systematic assessment of the present conditions and an overall strategy to defeat apartheid in a time of deep demoralization. So let me just conclude the debates of this period in which Dadoo was a leading figure can be viewed as evidence of the complex transition from the multiracial approach of the Congress Alliance of the 1950s to the creation of a unitary non-racial liberation front under the leadership of the ANC. The significance of the debates that took place in this period was that the ANC and its allies were able to stay together by working out effective and acceptable strategies and structures, thanks to the overarching commitment to unity of all the dominant strands in the Congress Alliance and the Communist Party. Despite of the disagreements, the issues and arguments that emerged in this period were ultimately not about not whether but how this could be best achieved. And given the huge divisions in South African society along the lines of race, class, and gender, this was quite a remarkable achievement. Just as a final conclusion, as an historian, I should point out that the past rarely presents a usable model for the present, but I hope that this history still holds lesson and inspiration for us to confront the challenges of today. Thanks very much. Yunus, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lisoni, for an interesting paper and one that has got a tremendous amount of depth. Could I just remind all our guests that if you have any questions, please do post them in the chat, and we'll pass them over to Dr. Lisoni later. I'm going to call on somebody who's going to read some excerpts on Dadoo from Kathrada's memoirs. whenever we asked Kathy about those who had a great influence on him, without fail, Kathy would mention Dr. Dadoo. And we do have Kathy's own words in his memoirs, and I'm going to call on Obakeng Khache, who is the director of the youth program at the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, to read some excerpts on Dadoo from Kathrada's memoirs. Obakeng, over to you.
Thanks, Uncle Eunice. We have load shedding this side, so I don't know if turning on my video would assist because it's a bit dark. But as you mentioned, my name is Obakeng Khatpe. I'm the Youth Program Manager, the Youth Activism Program Manager at the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. And I will just be taking everyone through to Kathy's thoughts on Dr. Dadoo, their relationship, and how he really influenced his political participation. So I think this is this is from the memo, as you mentioned, No Bread for Mandela. That is what it's titled. And I am reading from page 28 to 37. I'll be taking some excerpts from there. This is titled Dr. Dadoo, the Dadoo Factor. So it's basically about how he played a very pivotal role in his life. It states here that it was at about the age of 9 when Kathy first heard of Dr. Yusuf Dadoo. And he mentions here in his own words that he was like a guiding light in the arena of political activism. It states, in my child's eyes, he became larger than life. I grew up trying to memorize everything I heard and read about him, and would cling to his every utterance or statement. It was in 1939 that politics as opposed to race consciousness first made an impact on my young mind. This can be ascribed to a combination of things impacted on my young mind. This can be ascribed to a combination of things, but foremost among them is what I call the Dadoo factor. And he takes us on Dr. Dadoo's perspective on education and access to this, something that we continue to fight for even now. And an extract of that says, I remember the adults discussing his emphasis on education and his criticism of extravagant weddings. He maintained that the large amounts of money spent on weddings should be used for education instead, and pleaded with parents to send their daughters to school and university so as to facilitate their integration into the broader spectrum of society. Yusuf Dadoo qualified abroad as a medical doctor. In those years, not even the so-called liberal South African universities admitted students who were not white. The few doctors and lawyers who managed to study outside the country were looked upon as leaders and role models. In Kathy's words, he says, but Dr. Dadoo was exceptional. Even with this illustrious circle of people, he was charismatic, fiery, frank, and bold in his utterances, courageous in his actions, and far-sighted in his vision. I guess this then speaks to us about the vision that he really put his life on the line for, fighting for this country and trying to shape the political space that the country found itself in. More relevant for me, Kathy states, was his advocacy of the unity and equality of all oppressed people. I think this is something that Dr. Ariana has just alluded to on the document that she was taking us through, the discussion document, which states his argument on the second development being the importance of the unity and equality of all oppressed people. Kathy continues to say that Dr. Dadoo had already become a legend by the time I was 10 years old. Soon I became friends with children whose fathers were colleagues, and I began to catch were his colleagues, and I began to catch sight of him in their homes. It was on one occasion that he actually spoke a few words to me. Can you imagine what that meant? I believe it was the moment that the exciting world of political activism, the arena in which one stood up against injustice and oppression, beckoned me. One of my friends at school was Yusuf Kachalia, a shy, clever boy. At his home, I met his uncles and family figures during this era. So it then continues to then take us through a journey of how Dr. Dadoo really influenced Kathy and the kind of friends that they had at the time, especially those whose parents were highly involved in the political space and everything that was happening in the country. He continues to say, young as we were, we listened to a great deal of political talk, and these were undoubtedly the formative years of our political consciousness. And I think this takes us to the debate on really how young can someone be to be influenced and be able to understand the political surroundings that they live in. And I guess it will be a conversation for another day, but it should give us a moment to reflect on how, as a country, we are really trying to build the political consciousness of young people and the contributions to that. Do we have good leaders who are setting great examples to these, or do we need to do better and find people amongst ourselves and amongst our society who can actually play the role that Yusuf Dadoo really played in the life of Ahmed Kathrada? He continues to say, with typical childhood enthusiasm, my Johannesburg friends and I were soon distributing political leaflets, putting up posters and writing slogans on walls with lumps of chalk. It was wartime, and with the not inconsiderable experience of 10 whole summers behind us, we accepted with alacrity the anti-war party line. How could we not? Was our hero, Dr. Dadoo, not in prison for publicly and boldly opposing what he termed the imperialist war? And had we not learned of the atrocities being perpetrated by the British imperialists in India? We distributed copies of the statement that Dadoo made in court, and I learned snatches of it by heart, reciting it at every opportunity. I accepted without hesitation that in this war, the rich got richer and the poor got killed. All this was well and good, but we needed to do more, something daring in order to display our solidarity with our jailed hero. And I think just the last one that I will take you through, not to waste more time, it reads, as my school days began to draw to a close, my life became increasingly intertwined with that of Dadoo. And over the years, a whole spectrum of relationships crystallized between us. He became my leader, my colleague, my father, my older brother, my guide, my mentor, and my friend. And I like to think there was an occasion or two where he was my doctor. Thank you. That's where I ended. I think, like I said, it just, for me, is a reflective moment of, do we have leaders today who can influence young people as young as 12 or 9-year-olds to understand the political atmosphere of our country and want to take action to it? If you sit down and reflect and think that we don't, what is it that we can do to be the Yusuf Dadoos of our time? Thank you, Uncle Yunus.
Thank you very much for that, Obakeng. Could I just, we'd like to now call on a representative for the South African Communist Party. Ronnie Casserols is on the chat. He is having difficulty with his connection. So we're going to try and be a little creative. I'm going to, I've got him on a WhatsApp call, and I'm going to try and get him to talk to you through this call. So please bear with us, and let's see if we can get Ronnie on. Ronnie, please go ahead.
Thank you, Comrade Chair. Are you able to hear me? I'm so sorry, but the computer reception is totally unstable in my area for reasons beyond me. So I trust that you can hear me. And I must say that it's an honor to have been... Sorry, can you hear me, comrades?
Yes, Ronnie, we can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. It's a great honor to. It's a great honor to have been invited. I have been requested by the Secretary General of the Communist Party to speak on behalf of the party. And, Comrade Chair, I'm not going to overindulge. I'm not going to give 2 speeches because, of course, you invited me in my own capacity. But, of course, I am a communist and I'm a co-opted member to the Central Committee. So it's easy. And I'm not changing what I was going to say at all, except to extend greetings from the Communist Party to the meeting. And of course, the Communist Party is eternally grateful to Dr. Yusuf Dadoo, to Comrade Yusuf, who was such an outstanding leader of the Communist Party, was a chairman from the time that the party was banned. He became chair of the Underground Party in 1952, after the party had gone underground. He remained the chair until 1960, when the party sent him abroad as the ANC sent. And in that period, J.B. Marx had become the chair of the party until his death in 1972. Comrade Yusuf Dadoo again then became in exile the chairman of the Communist Party until his unfortunate death in 1980, in the 1980s. 1983 to be exact. I was extremely fortunate to have served under him and met him for the first time when I was sent from Tanzania after training abroad in the Soviet Union to join the underground unit and command in London, chaired by Comrade Yusuf, together with the secretary of that command, which was Joe Slovo, Jack Hodgson and myself, and we worked in terms of reconstituting the party back home, our attempts to do that, and we wore two hats at the same time. We linked with Comrade Tambo and the ANC from Morogoro to Lusaka, and then through the RC and the PMC in the work that we did. I'm sorry, I'm a bit confused. I'm hearing so many voices. So I'm going to leave your webinar, and you've got me to speak here. It'll avoid me not listening to my echo and to other voices. Okay, comrades. So let me say this. That to remember Comrade Dadoo in his 40th anniversary of the death, is to remember him in a multifold way, and not simply a quest for non-racialism in exile. Of course, Comrade Ariana has given us the detail about how the exiled or external leadership, which was on the one hand ANC based in Tanzania at first and then later in Zambia, and the London Party grouping in London. Now, at first there was the geographic divide. This wasn't the era of the Zoom, and we see the problems it can create today, but of the webinars and the mobile phones, etc. It was very difficult to be in touch, and we did so through secret writing and in the mails, or traveling from the one place to the other. So Dr. Dadoo, Comrade Yusuf, traveled immensely, as he did not just to Africa, as Comrade Slovo did, and J.B. Marx, but of course across the world, through all the various conferences, and especially the Communist International. I want to quote from Joe Slovo, which gives us some insight now into your topic, quest for non-racialism, and what I'm trying to add. Now, I'm not being critical of your title, but I want to bring out a depth from that, which is not just about non-racialism. So, Comrade Slovo, who was clearly Comrade Yusuf's greatest friend and comrade, and they worked together as an absolute dynamic team from abroad in terms of the party's role and in terms of national liberation and unity with the ANC. So Comrade Slovo said, quoting, "There are few figures in our history to match Yusuf Dadoo's grasp in practice of the very complex relationship in our country between national struggle and class struggle. In terms of the phraseology, national struggle deals with the national issue and therefore the ethnic divisions. And of course, in South Africa,
the paramountcy of race divide, and with it race discrimination and oppression. And therefore, in terms of a national struggle, the focus on a national liberation and emancipation, the extent to which this then integrates with the class struggle has always been a key factor in the first place for the Communist Party, but it also became the question for the ANC, as it did the other liberation movements. Bear in mind that particularly Frelimo and the MPLA of Angola tried to fuse that, and it was problematic for them because they didn't have a proletariat to speak of in their countries in relation to a class struggle, giving rise to a working class struggle for socialism, unlike South Africa. And incidentally, comrades, it's very much the issue of the day in South Africa today. And this is why the way Comrade Yusuf, Dadoo, and that leadership of Kutani and Marx and Slovo and so on grappled with the issue over the years is very, very pertinent to this time. It is complex, as Comrade Slovo pointed out, and as I'm underlining here. So let us also, just in passing, before we come through to the external mission, as I say, Comrade Mariana has given us quite a detailed insight there, but bear in mind that when Comrade Yusuf comes back to South Africa in 1936, after studying in Britain, and this is where he really develops his class consciousness, because as a young boy in South Africa and seeing the indignity of race discrimination and what his father had to put up in his business, etc., it's as happens in South Africa if you're not white, the racial aspect is the one that really comes to mind and infuriates one, etc. If you're a worker, the class issue really is in every day of your life. But if you're intellectual, like many of us are, middle class and so on, today even, it's a bit distance that we have to come in terms of a consciousness to begin to understand that. Comrade Yusuf in Britain is involved with the labour movement, with communists, both in London and then in Edinburgh, where he studies medicine, qualifies there, and also the Indian national movement. So this really conscientizes him. When he comes back to South Africa, his first clash and struggle is with the supine bourgeois leadership of the Transvaal Indian Congress. And we know the history of that, but bear this in mind, because here you see a leader who has both class and race or national understanding. And he understands what these guys are up to and why they have to be removed from leadership in order to mobilize the Indian community in a positive struggle against discrimination that they are feeling in terms of the Land Tenure Act, and they get involved in the passive resistance campaigns and so on. He mobilizes this. He's such a clear, courageous firebrand of a leader. And in the process, he understands that the future of the Indian community in South Africa must be with the Black oppressed. This is absolutely intrinsic to his understanding. It brings him into the Communist Party. It brings him so closely tied in with the ANC and the masses that he becomes a national hero. And fast forward to him being honored by the ANC with the Isitwalandli Award given to him and Chief Luthuli and Household of the Congress of People in 1955. I just want to mention here, before I get into that external theatre, that Comrade Yusuf was so incredibly courageous and committed that we must, and comrades must read about that period, and you can do so by going online and reading the South African history online, and also Communist Party history, because he's arrested and he's imprisoned on 2 occasions for 6 months at a time, and it's hard labor. And he faces them again in terms of the 3rd time with his defiance and others, and he's prepared to go back into prison. But fortunately, there's a loophole in the law, and that doesn't occur. Okay, so we know about his exit in 1960 abroad, but bear in mind he's become the chairman of the South African Communist Party, and they've been working underground as well. So they send him abroad. So Comrade Ariana has dealt with the external mission. I want to give you a little bit of anecdotal aspect to this, because this is when I'm working with him. And at this particular time, before the Morogoro conference, when there's so much criticism for the ANC leadership by young Chris Hani and others who feel that the ANC leadership are not focusing sufficiently on reconstructing the movement back home, etc. One of their demands is that the comrades from London, and they're referring to Joe Slovo and Comrade Yusuf and Rich September and Alex Luguma and Michael Harmel and Bernstein, these comrades from the party who they had such respect for and believed that they were being left out of the direct involvement in terms of the struggle from Africa. Well, there were particular reasons from that. With that, Comrade Ariana, I think, touched on it. I kept missing quite big patches of what she had to say. But the Revolutionary Council that comes out of the Morogoro conference, there is the pressure from these young MK comrades who were recruited in the 1960s of working class origin mainly. And from that point of view, a lot of them were communists or sympathetic to the Communist Party. They felt that the party, in terms of this leadership I've referred to, had to be involved as an important way of helping the ANC overcome huge problems of reorganizing back home and of infiltrating comrades back home. I won't go into all those problems. I think you know about it. And he becomes the deputy chair, Comrade Jambo, in the Revolutionary Council. The work that we then engaged in, that committee in London that I referred to, gave me an insight into the most humble, modest person who always listened to everybody else, sucking his pipe, and at the end, summing up and making such thoughtful inputs. It was just so sublime. I can't say how inspiring it was to be at the feet of this absolutely modest, kind human being. He was so warm. At the same time, he was so firm about the struggle. And on his deathbed, he said to Comrade Joe Slovo, who I was very intimately connected with, I was in Angola at the time. I'd kissed Comrade Yusuf goodbye 2 or 3 weeks before in his hospital bed. And what he was saying was never give up. Continue the fight until we've won socio-economic as well as political achievements in South Africa. In relation then to the Indian community, what first of all surprised me, because you see that command of ours, we were instrumental in organizing leaflet distributions back in South Africa using internationalists that we recruited. And one of the first leaflets that we sent into South Africa at the suggestion of Comrade Joe Slovo, as we sat in the meeting, Comrade Yusuf, we should send back a leaflet by you to the Indian community with our message of unity in the struggle and support for MK, and to counter all the adverse pressures on the community, which of course Yusuf had fought against back in the 30s. I think it was about the third leaflet that we produced, and we had to, it was very dangerous. We had to find at that point young, and they were usually young communists, trade unionists. Some, by the way, were just students at the universities, to take these things in, smuggle them in, and distribute them through leaflet bombs and through letters. And that particular one went to hundreds and hundreds of people and comrades within the young community. He was quite modest in that. I could see in response the comrade Slovo's encouragement that, we ought to send back a leaflet directly in your name. And he was so committed to the collective that he thought, why project his name? And then I cottoned on, and Jack Hodgson knew much about that period, and we basically said, Comrade Yusuf, yes, we want to endorse what Comrade Slovo is saying. I mean, there's so many wonderful anecdotes. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, comrades, just to say that how we understood this question, and how I would say Comrade Yusuf understood this quest for non-racism in exile. Let me just say this, that as Comrade Roche and his daughter would tell us, and I know Comrade Ariana was at Highgate Cemetery recently, but as I recall, on his headstone is the phrase, the use of Dadoo in the date of his birth and death, fighter for national liberation, socialism, and world peace. The comrades, in relation to his life, in relation to the question of non-racism in the movement and of what the future beholds in our country and internationally, it's so summed up. Comrade Yusuf would want us to continue to raise and understand the need for socialism and how it relates to national liberation, to world peace, to the regeneration of the ANC and the movement in this country. Testament on his deathbed from Joe Slovo, and you can read this online. Just saying that in terms of the free spaces, motivating ideals, that particular aspect. Secondly, and I'm quoting again, as part of this process, the growth of consciousness for the urgent need for unity with the majority of the oppressed, the African people, which led to unity in action of all oppressed and democratic forces. Thirdly, the development of class consciousness during those struggles as an integrable part, in fact, the key to creating a free socialist South Africa. Comrades, this is what I want to bring today, and this is what I'm sure Comrade Solly would applaud me for doing, because he didn't have a chance to brief me. In terms of that particular resolve of Comrade Yusuf Dadoo, so the quest for non-racialism, whether back in history as we battled to do this and find it within the movement, back in our country, and so much vital to what we're dealing with today, that quest for non-racialism in the movement, in the liberation movement, in the ANC, comrades. We know what we're talking about here, but in society as a whole. And we say this, I'm saying this on behalf of the party now. And that quest for non-racialism, comrades, you want to understand what drove Comrade Yusuf Dadoo and how he had his respect for his upbringing. And at his funeral, as you know, he said that there should be the Muslim rights as well. But the quest for non-racialism is the other side of the coin of the quest for socialism. The problem we have, comrades, in South Africa today, and I know we can't speak for the dead, but if you look at Comrade Yusuf Dadoo's life, can we doubt that he would not have been saying that the quest for our country today to resolve racialism, to resolve all the problems we face, is a quest for socialism? I'm absolutely certain this is the kind of legacy he has left us with, comrades. So thanks once again for giving me the opportunity and for also hearing a message from the Communist Party of South Africa. Siyabonga kakhulu.
Thank you very much for that, Comrade Ronnie. We certainly had to get creative here. Ronnie was talking to you through a WhatsApp call on my phone. So please excuse some of the breakup. I understand at some point the audio broke up a bit, but I trust that you got most of that. I just want to pick up a comment in the chat. I don't see any questions. If you really want to post questions, please do. But to Betty Govenden, who has indicated that she has 3 poems on Dr. Dadoo, and she'd like to share it with the group. Betty, could I request that you send them through to the offices of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, and we will ensure that we pass those poems on to all of the audience that you have on this webinar. There's also a comment from Lennox Class, and I'm going to just read it out. Lennox Class says, Lennox Class here, member of the Dr. Yusuf Dadoo ANC branch in Ward 70 Centurion. To Comrade ANC Kumalo, that's how we used to call him in exile and in MK because of his total commitment to the liberation of South Africa. Is it too much to expect and to believe people like Comrade Ronnie Casserols has still so much to give in the direction to help in the renewal of the ANC, the way I believe Comrade Dr. Yusuf did until his last breath? The ANC still needs people like Comrade Ronnie. Lennox, no need to, you apologize immediately after that for posting that. You don't have to. Thank you for that. If there are no further questions that you'd like to put up in the chat, we'd like to then move on with the program. And we are really fortunate that we have in this webinar the daughter of Dr. Yusuf Dadoo. Roshan Dadoo is here with us. Roshan is an activist in her own right, a remarkable person carrying on a remarkable legacy. And I'd like to call on Roshan to now deliver a message. Roshan, over to you.
Thanks so much. And I just want to start by really thanking the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, thanking yourself, Eunice, Shahida, and of course, Shan, for organizing this and for remembering and paying tribute to my dad on the 40th anniversary of his death. And I myself was only 18 when he died, so most of my memories of him are childhood memories. But what I was thinking about it, when I was thinking about it and looking back, thinking what to say about my relationship with my dad, I think I wanted to focus on my political formation, which I think comes directly from my dad and also my mum's political consciousness. And I wanted to emphasize their humanity, humility, and humor. whilst being single-mindedly committed to the struggle. And I think maybe those values we need to look again at, because I think in many ways we have lost a lot of our humanity and our humility. Maybe we still have a sense of humor though, but we need to recommit ourselves single-mindedly to the ongoing struggle, as Ronnie mentioned. And I think my dad was a Marxist in a very profound sense. And whilst he's often caricatured as a Stalinist for his support for the Soviet Union, in fact, his anti-imperialism during the Cold War didn't lead to a dogmatism in relation to our struggle. And I think Arianna and Ronnie have both elaborated on that point. And Ronnie has raised also the point, I think, Shan, you sent round this book in a PDF, which is really good and includes correspondence with my dad and Mahatma Gandhi. And on page 294, there's one letter he writes to Gandhi trying to explain the conservative leadership under Suleiman Nana of the Indian, it wasn't called the Congress, I think, at that moment, and the way the youth wing at the time, of which he was one of the leaders, was trying to push them towards passive resistance, because Gandhi was wondering why they were not embarking more urgently on the passive resistance campaign. And it's very telling, the class nature within the so-called Indian community of who wanted to actually make a deal with the British at the time regime over laws that would have impacted upon the loss of rights for that community. And I think it's important that we remember that in looking back in our own history, because it's not just plain sailing that we can airbrush over some of the contradictions, because the important part is how do we deal with them? We know that they're going to occur through our struggle, and it's trying to find a way to be able to understand that, but to move forward. And I think that is something that my dad had a particular influence on me. And I think that it's, as Ronnie mentioned, of course, this approach to understanding the race and class nature of our struggle and the inevitable contradictions that arise in struggle that have really informed me. And therefore, I think, you know, people say, oh, what do you think your dad would have thought about our current conjuncture? And I think it's really less relevant. That is less relevant, but it's more important to think, how would he have thought about it? And can we apply his way of thinking in order always leading to praxis, how we can apply that to the situation we're in, which is where the contradictions have sharpened, and where I think it's necessary to look at where we didn't succeed in our struggle. Yes, we dismantled apartheid, but we still have the legacy of apartheid in the lack of having dismantled the colonial underpinnings, in effect, the questions of land, the questions of ownership of the means of production, and so on. But I think another area that we have not fully addressed at all is the questions around, for instance, gender-based violence, questions that affect our communities profoundly and also inhibit the struggle from going forward. And so I think now, if we, in the current moment, we can learn from other struggles and we can develop a more intersectional approach. If we had been able to bring those struggles together, if we had not thought of one being more important, or the struggle for gender equity and women's rights as being secondary, something that would come about after we had won our national liberation, we might be in a better position. But that's something we can address now. Intersectionality with feminist struggles, with LGBTIQ+ rights, with climate activists. And I know there's a climate action taking place today. I saw Sunny Morgan had put it on the Kathrada Foundation group. And that's critical. We're facing a climate catastrophe created by capitalism, created by the West. But if we can't find ways to intersect those struggles, we are going to not be able to take the struggle forward at all. And the other important one is anti-xenophobia. We cannot continue to allow this sort of divisions, as Ronnie was saying, around race, but now indeed around all sorts of other divisions, around going back to kinds of tribalisms and xenophobia We have to be able to grapple with these issues that are rife in communities, all kinds of communities, and take a lead in addressing them. And I want to, of course, say here, both my parents were always committed to the struggle of the Palestinians. And of course, my dad was meeting with PLO comrades in various parts of the world. Our struggles are connected. And I think even more starkly now, Mandela's words around our struggle being incomplete without the struggle of the Palestinian people is more and more is more and more true, rings more and more true. And so I think we can say the contradictions are sharper than ever in South Africa. And the ANC and the SACP are riddled with contradictions. And I won't go into the utter hollowing out of politics within the ANC structures, the corruption, the turn towards reactionary populism, and empty rhetoric, empty struggle rhetoric. That is no longer being evidenced with pro-poor praxis. But instead, I hope we can learn more about our own history, and especially for young people. And webinars such as this are great, because that's exactly where we can look and critically look at our own struggle and what we still need to do going forward. And I think what we need to look at is how our movements navigated the terrain of struggle, because this is the only way to help us determine a way forward towards a truly socialist and ultimately communist society. So I will end there. And I think you can see that something I did learn from my dad was to be critical, to think critically, to be outspoken, and to be committed to collective work, to collectively trying to always take the struggle forward. Amandla.
Thank you for that, Roshan. In the chat, we note Zaza Machakela, who's just posted that if our objective of non-racialism is to be realized, Dr. Dadoo's role in the struggle and that of many communist leaders must be appreciated fully. Thank you for that post, Zaza. As we wind down to the conclusion of this webinar, we've just had a glimpse into the life of this remarkable leader, and we are really grateful to Dr. Lisoni for such a insightful paper, and of course to Comrade Ronnie for giving us the insights that he has on the life and the times of Dr. Yusuf Dadoo. When we started, we were going to call on Prema Naidu from the board to say a word of welcome. Razia Saleh did that on his behalf, but Prema, would you like to just say a few words?
I know, first of all, I would like to apologize. I had some connectivity problems, and I want to apologize for that, but I seem to be okay now. Now, I think, we're celebrating the life of a remarkable man, a man that lived before his time, talked about non-racialism, talked about a shared society. And I'm pleased that the Katara Foundation had this seminar today to remember Yusuf Dadoo for the role he played in our liberation movement. And, I want to thank everybody who took part in the seminar and made comments. Thank you very much. Thank you, Yunus.
Thank you for that, Prema, and thank you to everybody for your attendance on this webinar. We do apologize for all the technical glitches which we had to overcome, but thank you and God bless.